Hi, and welcome to this episode of HR and Cocktails. We are so excited because today is our first day in our new studio. For those of you who are listening, we are in an amazing space. We are in the Speakeasy. We have our neon lights, and we are so excited. In the studio with me today, I have Valerie Dubinsky, VP of HR for Prescott HR. Hi, Valerie.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello. Good morning.
So, Valerie, tell me about you and your role at Prescott HR.
Well, I've been with Prescott HR for about 4 or 5 years already.
I know.
I started as a consultant, and we've grown so much, so we've moved into a role where I'm the VP of operations. So I manage the consultant now, all the consultants, and we make sure everybody's ship is running, in a straight line. So.
Yeah, I say you make the trains run on time.
Oh, thank you.
So before we get into the interview, though, let's get to the cocktail. So what cocktail would you like?
I would like a French 75.
A French 75. All right. I am going to get you a French 75 with gin.
Okay.
All right. So that is coming up.
Great. Thank you.
Our guest Valerie requested a French 75 for her drink, so we're going to make it. You can make a French 75 with various spirits, but we are going to use gin. I have a Bombay Sapphire gin. You can use whatever gin you'd like. You're going to start with a shaker with ice. We're going to put a little ice in. I already have some in, but I'm going to put one more just so you can see. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with 1.5 parts of gin. So you can use, you have a double-sided jigger. Good thing is that one side is 1, the other side is half. So it makes it super easy to do 1.5. So we're going to do that. We're going to do our 1.5 pour of gin. The next ingredient is going to be a 1/2 part of lemon juice. So I've already squeezed some fresh lemon juice. It is important for your cocktails to use fresh juice. Additionally, whenever you use any cocktail that has juice in it, you should shake it. I know some people say shake in and not stir it or just stir it, but when it's fruit juice, you definitely want to shake it. So we're gonna put a 1/2 part of our fresh squeezed lemon juice in here. We're gonna pour that in here. And then we're going to take a 1/2 part of simple syrup. You can make simple syrup very easily, or you can buy some from the store. You're gonna take a 1/2 part of your simple syrup because that's gonna cut some of the acidity. And what we're going to do is put our top on here and we're gonna shake it. You gotta shake it at least 30 seconds because you wanna make sure, I'm gonna tell you this before I start shaking. So you wanna make sure you stir it for at least shake it for at least 30 seconds. And just use your arm with your watch on it so you can get credit for your movement today. For time's sake, I'm not gonna do 30 seconds, but you have to do 30 seconds. So I usually typically use the strainer on top of my shaker for something like this, so we'll just pour it right into our champagne flute. For me, stemware is extremely important based on the drink. Some people don't care, but it matters to me. This drink would either be a coupe glass or a champagne flute. And then you will top it off with some champagne. I have a rosé champagne, which is gonna give it a nice little pink color. Typically this recipe doesn't call for that, but that's what I had, so this is what we have and it makes it pretty. And then you wanna garnish with a lemon peel. I'm really not that good at that part, but it'll work. All right, Valerie, here you go. Here's your French 75. So for those of you who are listening, and yes, thank you, it kind of fell apart. But for those of you who are listening and watching, you'll notice that the color is a little pink. That's because I only had rosé champagne, which makes it a little pink. Typically, it's not this color, but it'll still taste the same. It'll be awesome. So cheers.
Cheers.
All right, tell me about the drink. Let's taste it.
I have to taste it.
Take this lemon thing off because it's gonna fall. It's good.
Very good. It's a bit strong.
It's a cocktail.
This will be
good. Okay. So what made you pick the French 75?
Well, because I'm French. And And I've never had one before, but so it sounded good. The ingredients sound good. So you can't go wrong with champagne.
Yes.
You can't go wrong with gin.
Yeah.
A lemon twist.
Yes, and lemon juice.
Lemon juice.
It's pretty straightforward.
So,
Simple syrup. It's pretty straightforward. So we, the audience who got to see us make that, so they know what to do. Hopefully they'll make it at home and post their pictures on social media. That will be awesome. So, Valerie, the topic today is what is human resources, right? I think similar to sometimes when I hear people say, they do marketing, I think a lot of different things because there are a lot of things that fall under the umbrella of marketing. And I think the same thing is true for our industry, human resources. So if you had to boil the ocean of human resources, what would you say, at its core, human resources is?
Yeah, at its core, I would say that it's largely compliance, ensuring that the company is compliant as far in all aspects of employees. So their hiring process, their termination process, their I-9s, their forms that need to be completed, their benefit programs, all those types of things are included. In addition, there are employee relations. You have that piece. There's benefits pieces, there's compensation pieces, a whole bunch of pillars within HR that we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I think about HR as well, I mean, those things absolutely have to get done because if they don't, people really don't care about all the other things that happen in the organization. But I also think that HR is advice and counsel, right?
Yes.
So it's the place where leaders should come, right? When you leverage HR properly, where they should come to just get advice because, organizations have their business plan, they have their strategic plan, they have all these things in place, but they typically don't have a strategy for how they're going to align the people strategy to that business strategy, right? And so I think that's also where HR comes in. And you come from a pretty solid corporate HR background. So talk to me a little bit about how you see HR playing a role in aligning the people strategy with the business strategy, and kind of what does that look like when it's used correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good to know what your business goals are. That's the first thing. And what the future looks like for the organization. So are you going to be growing over, the last 10 years? Is customer service a priority? If you work with customers, and we all do in some way, shape, or form, where is the business going? Is it a product that you have in development? And all those things come together with how are you going to develop it? And who's going to develop it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that when you think about growing the organization, new products, that also plays a role in workforce development. Are we going to need a different type of skill in our organization? Right. Are we going to be able to do that thing locally? Are we going to have to offshore it? Do we need to go to California? Don't go to California. Or California's a nice place, but from an employment perspective, it's very challenging.
It's tough.
But you have to think about those things. And listen, when leaders don't get HR involved in that conversation proactively, they open a call center in California and don't understand that they got to pay overtime for over 8 hours.
Right.
Where if they had had that conversation, and the conversation with HR could have been, we just want to have a West Coast presence. So put it in, New Mexico, or because Arizona doesn't observe daylight savings time, so it would need to be a state that does. So put it somewhere else for the West Coast presence, right?
Right.
So I think it's so important for organizations to understand the need to involve HR proactively when making business decisions and not bringing HR in at the time of execution, which has been historically the case.
Absolutely.
So you and I have been in HR for, approximately the same amount of time. And, I think that we came into the world of HR when HR was still personnel, right?
Exactly.
And so that was a very transactional HR, right?
Correct.
And so over the last few years, we've, heard the last 20 plus years, we've heard the terms seat at the table, which I'm so glad is over. I'm glad that everyone has eaten and it no longer needs to be sitting at the table. But what we've seen now is a shift to a need for strategic HR.
Yes.
What is strategic HR? How is that different from transactional HR or personnel of old?
Yeah, it's exactly what you've been talking about being involved in business decisions from the beginning and not just when needed, not just the daily onboarding somebody and offboarding somebody and those type of things, not just when there's a problem. But at the very beginning and working through solutions that involve people, which just about any business decision does in some way, shape, or form, and working together to find those solutions.
Exactly. And, you you were my very first guest on my very first episode when we were audio, and you're the very first guest on a video episode. A lot has changed since then, right?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've seen that a pandemic. Fun. It has. It has. It's been a time where HR has really had to honestly either sink or swim. And because during the pandemic, we were the first responders of corporate. So not to take anything away from the actual first responders because they had a very tough job, right?
Right.
But in the work world, we were the first responders. We had to help interpret all of those regulations. What does the leave look like? What does return to work and spacing look like? Masks, vaccines, pay, don't pay, right?
And every state and county was different in a lot of ways.
So. Yeah, everyone. And the federal government was giving advice and counsel through the CDC and OSHA. But then, of course, there were, to your point, jurisdictions that had their own regulations about what could be open and what couldn't. So given the fact that we've seen so much change in the world of HR, what do you think some of the lessons learned for HR professionals who maybe had not made that transition, or organizations who had not made that transition to strategic HR, who were still leveraging HR to plan company parties and, make sure that everybody had their work anniversary recognized, right?
Right.
How do you think that has changed, or has it?
I think it depends on the organization. We got very busy in some ways. In some ways, there were organizations that had to shut down. So we couldn't help them because there was no business to help. So they had to either pause their business for a period of time if they, had an open public place that people came in. They didn't have a need for us because, they didn't have anybody working. So it was a little different depending on the client. And in some ways, I think you've got to be flexible. You've got to be able to look at the situation. You've got to be able to look what's in front of you and how to resolve each issue. So there's not a cut and dry. And sometimes I know we get challenged with everything needs to be cut and dry, but it's not at all. You've got to look at all aspects of the situation and also what that business wants to do and how we can achieve it, in the way that needs to be, compliant.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. My cousin is an actual emergency room urgent care doctor, so he hates this example. I think it's absolutely appropriate. HR is like a practice. It's like the practice of medicine and the practice of law. Like you take all of your experiences and you apply it to each situation because no situation is the same, and you never know what's going to come through the door. You never know what's going to happen that day. You wake up in the morning and you're like, today is great, and then you're like, oh, somebody did that for real.
And you have to think 10 feet ahead of that, too.
Exactly.
So what could happen?
Exactly. And so I think that for the organizations that really want to learn and grow, the last several years have really helped them to understand the importance of investing in people, the importance of investing in a true human resources function, which is not just payroll and recruiting and onboarding and firing, but it's all those things in between. So when you think about, we kind of talked about a little bit about what HR is, and if you had to describe based on what you hear and your experiences from an HR perspective, What would you say that HR is not?
It's not. It's not throwing parties. You mentioned that one, and then sometimes, it's not payroll, and we work a lot with smaller employers, so. From a strategy standpoint, it's a little bit different. You definitely are more involved, I think, in a lot of ways because everybody knows everybody, and then you're really much, everybody's together in every single meeting. So you're more involved and you know more about the organization. So in that way, I think it's pretty promising. But it is a switch because it could be the first time they've ever had HR within that organization. So they're learning a whole bunch of new things, and a lot of them are small business owners that never had to deal with HR. So sometimes they're not quite sure what it is. They just know it has to deal with people. So what we typically do is once we start the audit process, which is really the first step when we bring on a new employer on board, and we look at everything, every aspect of HR from beginning to end. And when we're asking for the information for that audit, then they start to realize, and then sometimes they get a little scared, we don't have this, we didn't realize, you were going to ask for this. And that's okay. That's what we're there for. That's what we're looking at to make sure we have a baseline on where we need to begin and the things that we need to do.
Yeah, and I think that it's important that you talk about audit because I think that many organizations, particularly the ones that have an HR department, they don't always do an internal audit of their practices. They're like, we have people in HR, so we don't necessarily need to do that. But the reality is that you do, because sometimes you're so close to the situation that you can't see some of the gaps and some of the things that you need to be focusing on. So, I think that, auditing, making sure that you're looking at everything that you're doing is absolutely important. And so
I tend to find that those larger corporations, companies that I've worked with, they tend to audit it when a problem comes up, right? So instead of doing a regular review of everything and making sure we have these processes in place, which most of the time they do, but are we following them? And if we're not, why are we not following them? What is hindering us from following it? And making sure we have a solution in place to move forward.
Exactly. And I think, because I too have worked for large corporations, and you'd be surprised some of the basic things that they don't have in place.
Right.
And so I think that that's important for our listeners to think about is you may have a large organization that has a lot of processes. However, I think many organizations are focused on the piece of the business that actually makes them money, right? So if you're a widget company, you're focusing on making widgets, making sure you're making widgets correctly, efficiently, not having a lot of damaged widgets. That's really where the organization is focused, right? Selling the widgets. But when it comes to the behind the scenes of making sure that the people that make the widgets are okay,
right,
and that they have all the things that they need, that's sometimes where there's not a lot of focus. And you find that even the most effective organizations sometimes don't have some of those basic things. So when we talk to our listeners about what HR is, what are some, so you talked about compliance, you talked about onboarding. What about culture? What role does HR play in organizational culture?
HR doesn't typically develop the culture or determine what the culture is going to be. Sometimes that's organic. Sometimes that's, where the leaders want the organization to go. That needs to be determined because it can be different. Every company I've worked with has a different culture, and every leader had a different idea of what that culture should look like. So once that culture is determined, HR supports it, and there's different ways to support that culture. So, if it's very product driven or customer service driven, making sure that training that is developed is, identifies that. If it's, very product driven, same thing. Make sure they're training, everybody learns about the product in detail. So determine that the culture, it can be so many different things. Some companies, are really all about the wellness piece of it, and really focused on that. And then I've seen other companies, it's, of course they want their employees to be well, but that's not the thing that they're focused on. So,
And I think you make a really good point that culture is not something that is created by HR. We've seen a lot of these new titles that are coming up because people, for whatever reason, have decided that HR is no longer a term that they want to use. So it's talent management, it's people management, and there's, this position of, people and culture, right?
Yeah.
And so
Seen that a lot.
think, yeah, exactly. So I think it's important that people understand, that leaders and organizations understand that the culture piece that HR plays is to support the culture.
Right.
It's not to develop it. And I also think it's important to understand what culture is and what culture isn't. Culture is not your core values. Your core values support your culture, but your culture is actually the personality of your organization and how people feel when they're there. Right? It's the feeling. And that's not something that you can just write down. It's not just something that you can just say, this is our culture. We have a culture of this. You can have that on paper, but if that's not how people feel, that's not your actual culture. Right? And so then the activities, the policies, the employee experience, everything that goes along with that should support it. So I think that's really a very important point, because I do think that there are many leaders, particularly of smaller organizations, that just feel that that's something that HR should just do. Develop the culture, manage the culture. It's like, yeah, but you set the tone for the organization, leader.
Right. And some of the best organizations, the culture grew organically based upon the leadership and supporting that. And then you see a change in leadership and some of that culture goes away.
Yep.
And you see, that's why you see people leaving when leaders leave, because it's a change, not necessarily it's bad or good. It's just a change, and people can't always adapt to that.
And I think too, like, when we talk about the pandemic, going back to that, there were a lot of people who, the organizations that said, we can't maintain our culture online.
Right.
And it's like, well, what was your culture? Because if you had a culture of accountability, you can maintain a culture of accountability online. You can absolutely do that. So I think
it's more of a fear that they don't know what's going on.
Exactly. And I also think that it is leaders conflating culture with activities.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. And so those things are not always the same. There are activities that support the culture, but the culture is not the activities, right? So they're like, well, we used to have company picnics and we used to have spouses come and that was our culture. Like, no, those were activities. Right. And so I think it's really important for organizations to understand that. So we talked about, compliance, which is an important part of HR. What about systems? So, because when I think about systems, I think about employee experience. So, if you can't log in and see the things that you need to see, if you don't have easy access to the things that you either need to do your job, the things that you need to do your job, or things that you need as a resource, that impacts the employee experience. So, talk a little bit about systems and the role that systems play from an HR perspective in the employee experience.
Yeah. So we work with, again, the smaller employer that maybe hasn't adapted to a system to onboard, or a system to do training, or a system for employees even to see their paychecks. And that's what everybody's doing. Everybody is banking online. Everybody is doing everything, paying their bills online. And I sometimes still have people say our employees won't know how to use this, and I'm still surprised by that. That people of all ages are using computers these days, and they'd prefer it. Nobody wants to fill out that paper form and scan it in or fax it in, or walk it over to where it needs to be, and especially in the environment that we're moving into, where a lot of people are remote. So systems are important, and we are doing tons of integrations. It seems like every month we have a new integration to do with a new, payroll system, an HRIS system, recruiting system, all those types of things, which is great. That and honestly, once they get access to those things, they're amazed about how much easier their life is.
Yes.
So
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you say about recruiting? Is recruiting HR or not?
recruiting is a part of HR. It's usually managed within HR,
Okay.
but it's a piece of HR.
Yeah.
It's like benefits and compensation. It's a pillar within HR.
Yeah.
But oftentimes those pillars don't talk to one another, and so there can be some challenges with making sure that they're all aligned within HR.
Yeah.
So.
And like for me, I feel that recruiting is HR adjacent. And I get it. Like it is a part of HR to a certain extent.
Right.
But I also feel that it's HR adjacent from the perspective of it's a different type of strategy that needs to be built. And recruiting in many organizations is lumped into when I see, particularly for smaller businesses, what they think of recruiting is just posting a job.
Yeah.
That is not a recruiting strategy. Right. That's what I call post and screen.
Right. Right.
That's not a strategy. So recruiting is, to me, HR adjacent in that it requires a completely different strategy, a different approach to how you view things. And so the execution of that is different than the execution of the people strategy for some other things. And I totally get that in some organizations, it falls under the HR umbrella. But I feel that organizations do themselves a disservice when they don't have a dedicated resource to recruitment.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you don't have it internally, right, then that's something that you should reach out to a firm that does recruiting, particularly for senior level positions.
Right.
Posting your COO job on Indeed should only be one part of your recruitment strategy.
Right.
It shouldn't be the only step that you take.
Right.
Because you're going to get a candidate that is looking for a job.
Right.
Which is a different candidate than someone who's
actively
engaged,
working.
Engaged in their current company doing their job with their heads down. That's a different person, right? And so when you have somebody building out a recruitment strategy and looking at who are our competitors, who are like companies, I need this person is here, they're doing a good job. I need to talk to this person. They're actually proactively going out and finding people. And that's a very different strategy.
I think it's certainly. You're not dealing with internal people, you're dealing with external people, but you still have to maintain the culture of the company. And when you're bringing them on board, you've got to make sure that, and sometimes I find this too, like recruiters are not aligned with HR, especially when they're outside the organization. But the good recruiters spend a lot of times learning about the organization and making sure that they don't, cross over into an area that just isn't going to happen for that organization. So, but I mean, let's face it, everybody's a recruiter. Everybody in your organization should be a recruiter in some sense. You're a representative of a company, and how you go out into the world is what people see as far as the organization. So you want to represent your company well, but also, you're recruiting all the time as a leader.
Agreed. And you should be. And I think that, it's important for organizations to understand that everyone should be a part of it and try to find a strategy to get everyone involved. So, we've talked about onboarding, we've talked about systems, we've talked about culture, we've talked about compliance. There are so many areas under the umbrella of HR. But I think that when we think about comp and benefits, there's a bit of, I guess, confusion for organizations around what that can and should be. I think that there are some organizations that feel that, I need to, outpay every other organization or throw everything but the kitchen sink at people to attract people or get people to stay. And that doesn't make people stay.
Right.
It might make them come, but it doesn't make people stay.
Right.
So can you talk about, compensation and benefit strategies, right? And what does that look like when applied successfully?
Right. Well, most benefits and comp people, they know what their compensation strategy is or their philosophy. Do they want to be on the upper end, or are they going to be competitive, or are they lagging? And sometimes they have to be, just based upon how well the business is doing. And generally, more junior company is going to be on the lower end because of that. But then over time, as they build their product or their service, they can enhance those features of their benefits and comp. Knowing what your compensation and benefits philosophy is one. If you can't spend a lot of money in one area, look at offsetting it in another area. Maybe you can provide more days off if you can't provide, a higher level of supporting benefits. So really looking at the total, what you have to offer and how you're going to utilize it in the best way and what your people want. So.
And I think you made an important point around having a compensation philosophy. There are a lot of organizations that don't post like what certain jobs make, and that's okay unless your state has a pay transparency law.
Yes.
But other than that, they may not post what jobs make, and that's fine, right? But it's going to be important to at least have a transparent compensation philosophy.
Right.
We pay in the 50th percentile. We pay in the 50th percentile with bonus availability to get to the 75th or whatever that might be, right? So that people at least know and have some visibility into that. And again, you mentioned that, making sure that people understand what it is, that you clearly communicate it, and that you are, allowing people to just clearly understand coming in the door. So we've covered so much about HR. Like we could talk for hours about what HR is, what HR isn't, but is there anything that we haven't covered about? Well, listen, a lot, right? But is there
we could go on and
exactly. But is there anything that you think that our listeners should specifically know about HR?
Gosh, everybody needs HR, whether, how you utilize HR within your organization, determines the outcome. And like you said, a lot of the smaller organizations that we work with are beginning to learn what we can and do. We've got to be able to show them, though. As HR professionals, we've got to show them what we're capable of doing and how we can, offer them some professionalism and point out different things that, maybe they weren't aware of. So, it's important for us to continue to educate, business owners, partners, all those others.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for us as HR professionals to start to learn to speak the language of the business.
Yes.
And also understand the ROI of the initiatives that we are recommending, and that they're not just feel-good initiatives, and how they impact the bottom line. I remember one time I was interviewing for a job with this executive, and, I got the job, but he said, HR is a necessary evil. And I was like, I don't know if that's good or bad. But at the end of the day, what he recognized is that he needed that support, and he needed a certain level of support. And he ended up being someone that I worked very well with. And then when I started my business, he went off and did something else and then brought me into that. So sometimes the necessary evil turns into a necessary relationship, into other things.
Well, I mean, if somebody thinks it's a necessary evil, it's they don't want to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I think something's a necessary evil, then, great, you deal with the necessary evil.
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with it. So.
But I want us to get to a point where we're not evil anymore, right?
Right.
So thank you so much, Valerie, for being here. Thank you for joining me in the Speakeasy. We're going to cheers.
And thank you for this
all
drink.
Right. Awesome. Yes. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. And those of you who are listening, we appreciate you tuning into this episode.